Good morning, guys. Welcome to another beautiful day. It's bright, sunshiny, blue skies. Hope you're finding something fun to do besides school, and spending your time maybe outside, taking a walk, learning a new skill. I'm thinking maybe learning cutting some shapes later today. Maybe it's something my daughter and I can figure out together. We'll see how that goes. This is a tough time for a lot of people, so keep in mind that the counselors are still there for you. So just shoot them an email if you need someone to talk to about this. They are available. They can do a phone call with you. They can do a Zoom meeting with you. So reach out to them. There are resources that can help you through this, because I know some people are having a tougher time than others. All right, today's lesson, I'm going to talk about Dred Scott today. Dred Scott is a Supreme Court case. I love this case. I love a lot of Supreme Court cases because the nature of the Supreme Court is the determination of what laws are actually enforceable, what laws actually determine the character and the nature of what our country is. So the legislature can make all the laws that they want, but the Supreme Court is the one that decides whether or not it is something that is true to the Constitution. They look at the U.S. Constitution and figure out, does this law fall in line with what our country was intended to be? So, this case, it's about a man named Dred Scott. He was a slave, born in Virginia in 1795-ish, depending on what records you go by. He was not, because slaves, they didn't take great care of recording exactly what year somebody was born, but he was born in Virginia. Virginia was a slave state, but it was one of the northernmost slave states. The ones north of that were free states. Born a slave. And then he and his master moved to Alabama, along with the other slaves. Moved to Alabama. Alabama, also a slave state. Moved to Missouri, also a slave state. Down to Louisiana, also a slave state. Now this moving around, you're like, why do we care? Why did we care if he's moving around? Well, up to this point, he's a slave moving through one slave state to another slave state to another slave state. Not a big deal, still a slave. But then he gets sold to a doctor who is stationed with the military, and he is sent to Illinois. Illinois is a free state. So is he still a slave? Dred Scott moved to Illinois with his master. Does his master get to keep a slave if he moves into a free state? That's the question. And he didn't just stay there for a weekend. He was there for a couple of years. Then they moved to Minnesota, which was a free territory at the time. I mean, it became a state, but it was a free area of the United States. No slavery was allowed here. But Dred Scott was there, and he was a slave. What does that mean? That's something that the Supreme Court had to decide. Well, they moved back down to Missouri, and that's when it was back into a slave state, and Dred Scott sued. Dred Scott filed a petition to sue his owners to say that he was no longer a slave because he had lived in a free state, in a free territory, and because of that, he had suddenly become no longer a slave. He sued on some other grounds. It was more like false imprisonment and beating a free man, but that's the way a lot of these court cases work. You file a case based on something related to your condition, and through the course of the Supreme Court decision, you actually determine whether or not you met the conditions necessary for that case to prove you guilty or innocent. So in this case, they had to decide whether or not he was indeed a free man in order to go with the false imprisonment charge. All right, so that's the question before the Supreme Court. And the country is watching and waiting and wondering, will it determine whether or not a house divided with some of the states slave and some of the states free, if that can continue? Is that even something that we can continue as a country, or is that something that's just impossible? That's the question. So, unfortunately, long story short, the Supreme Court case was a loss for Dred Scott. They decided that he did not win to be a free man. It was also a loss for the abolitionists because it meant that if slavery was permitted in one state, it effectively permitted slavery in any state. This is the way the Supreme Court ruled. And there was 3 major points to Judge Taney's decision, who wrote the argument for the Supreme Court. Number 1, Dred Scott was not necessarily a citizen because the U.S. Constitution didn't really call him a citizen. And because he wasn't a citizen, he couldn't sue in federal court. And this is one of those things about Supreme Court cases. Sometimes the decision that they make is that they can't make a decision. But the reason that they can't make a decision is something that's important too. Number 2, the Missouri Compromise couldn't prohibit slavery. So this is where you need to make sure you go back and you remember what the Missouri Compromise was. That was where anything above a certain geographic region could not have slavery, and anything below that could. So if the Supreme Court's deciding that the Missouri Compromise can't prohibit slavery, that means that does that mean the federal government cannot decide who gets to be a slave and who doesn't? And number 3, Dred Scott was property, and the government couldn't take away property from somebody, so this is something that the Supreme Court was not going to be able to do. All right, so we're going to examine these 3 arguments, break them down, because there is significance behind each one of them. Argument number 1, Dred Scott was not a citizen and can't sue in court. All right, so the Supreme Court examined the Constitution, U.S. Constitution, and decided that he wasn't identified as a citizen. Africans, people of African descent, were not identified as citizens, and therefore they didn't have a right to sue. This raised a huge question for whether race determines citizenship. And it would ultimately take a constitutional amendment that didn't happen yet, Amendment number 14, to make this clear. Argument number 2, the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional and couldn't prohibit slavery. Again, the Supreme Court examined the Constitution and examined the case of popular sovereignty. Could the people of a region have control over the laws that governed that region? I mean, this is something we've gone back to the days of the American Revolution, is can we have our own government? Can we decide for ourselves? And with states and the federal government, it's always a balance of a little bit of this and a little bit of that. This is one of those critical times where it really mattered a lot how much you could decide. How much popular sovereignty would a territory have? How much popular sovereignty would a state have? So if states and territories have their own governments, how much control do they have? Who gets to decide what is legal in that region? The people there or the federal government? So Judge Taney's decision of the Supreme Court said that you cannot decide this for that territory. If Missouri wants to have slavery, they can have slavery. They decide that for themselves. If Virginia wants to have slavery, they can decide that for themselves. It wasn't for the federal government to make that decision for them. Argument number 3. Dred Scott was property. This one is a little weak. The Supreme Court considered the Constitution, which says that you can't deprive a citizen of property without due process, meaning you can't just take it away from them without having a court case. You can't have a trial. You can't have legal arguments for it. But he decided that if he was property, then we couldn't take it away from him. All right, so here, why is Dred Scott significant? Number 1, African Americans were not recognized as citizens. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution finally included all races in this. Second significance is that slavery could not be illegal in only some places. It would have to be illegal in all places. So you had an all or nothing situation. Compromise was not working. Compromise was not effective. You can't say, well, we'll have slavery some places and other places not, if that's a decision by the federal government. One of the results of this was Abraham Lincoln, when he was campaigning to be the Senate in the U.S. Senate before the 1860 election. He was still working in the Senate. He spoke out against the Dred Scott decision in his famous House Divided speech. He said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free. Either the opponents of slavery will arrest the future spread of it, that means stop it, and put it in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, meaning that either it gets completely illegal everywhere or it's legal everywhere. You can't have both. It's got to be one or the other. The question I want you to ask today, and I want you to answer today, is why did compromise fail? Compromise is one of those great principles of government that in order for all parties to be satisfied, we need to compromise. But so why did compromise fail? I want you to use the Dred Scott decision as a foundation for your argument. What was there about the decision that demonstrated that compromise wasn't working? Your goals for the day. Number 1, log into both Schoology and Google Classroom. And number 2, answer the Fort Sumter questions if you haven't already. Use chapter 14 and my lecture as resources, and then also answer the question for compromise. Compromise, I'll make it a lightweight question and make it optional because I know you guys are still ramping up and still trying to get used to this stuff. But I want you to think about it. If you have time, if you feel you're up to it, try to develop an argument for why compromise failed. Stay safe, stay healthy. I'm going to put a couple of extra resource links in the transcript so that you can explore a little bit more about the Dred Scott decision and the House divided speech. All right, guys. Talk to you soon.